Alec Wallen is a philosophy and law professor at Rutgers University, and recently he wrote a very interesting article called Proportionality, Psychic Harm, and the Day After. The article is about the conflict between Israel and Palestine, about how we should decide which Israeli actions against Palestine are proportional. Now, I'm not an ethicist, and I'm not trying to imply I know more about philosophy than Wallen does, but the funniest thing about political philosophy, as far as I'm concerned, is that just anyone's allowed to do it. You literally cannot legally prevent me from doing this, and I think that's pretty dope. Wallen's paper is very odd. I think his argument has some pretty enormous problems, and I thought, you know what? Let's just go through it bit by bit. And with that, let's get started. So Wallen begins his paper by establishing a kind of moral conundrum. See, on October 7th, Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis. Israel then proceeded to occupy Gaza with the stated aim to take Hamas down. In this effort, by the time that Wallen wrote this paper, the IDF had already killed 12,000 mostly non-combatant Palestinians. And Wallen supposes that as many as 30,000 might be killed before Hamas is finally defeated. And that is in a best-case scenario that assumes that Israel tries to restrict civilian deaths as much as possible. Meanwhile, as Wallen writes,
it is hard to see how Hamas could cause more than a few thousand deaths in the foreseeable future.
So, isn't that an issue? Doesn't that mean that Israel is acting disproportionately, causing much more harm than Hamas has caused, or is in fact capable of causing? As he writes,
deaths to deaths, Israel's war is grotesquely disproportionate.
But Wallen looks at this case, compelling as it might seem, and says, don't be too hasty now, because you're not factoring in one really important thing: psychic harm. He writes,
deaths are not all that matter. Psychic harm matters too. Hamas has shown that it is undeterrable. Thus, if Hamas remains in power, it seems likely that it is only a matter of time until it attacks again. Living with that terror is a significant tax on the souls of Israelis, and this should count in the proportionality balance.
So there we have it. Wallen wants to argue in this paper that the harm caused by Israel could be proportional to the harm caused by Hamas when you factor in the emotional and psychological damage that Hamas inflicts on Israelis. Okay then, let's see if he sticks the landing. The first thing Wallen wants to do is establish the nature of the harm that Hamas is doing to Israel, why that psychic harm should be taken seriously. He writes,
the fear an Israeli experiences need not be that one will likely be killed. The fear need only be a source of ongoing significant trauma based in the thought that a substantial group of people just a few miles away are plotting and building the capacity to carry out a brutal attack that could target anyone in the country and that will likely kill thousands.
So already, I think we're off to a pretty rough start here. Okay, I agree with some of his logic. Even though it's extremely unlikely that any given Israeli will be killed by a Hamas attack, Hamas did cause many Israelis to be afraid. There's really no denying that. And making someone afraid is somewhat harmful to them. People don't generally enjoy experiencing fear. Still, this is a hard pill to swallow, isn't it? Wallen means to tell me here that the fear experienced by Israelis is so great that it makes killing 30,000 Palestinians a proportional response. Okay, whose fear? Are all the Israelis equally afraid? How afraid are they exactly? Are they able to carry out conversations, go to work? Or are they all just screaming all the time because of the unbelievably low chance they'll be killed by some future Hamas attack? These questions may seem in poor taste, but we're comparing this stuff to killing, right? We need to get our math straight. And that's another subtle red flag here. Why is this hypothetical math so convenient? The fear Israelis have is potentially proportionate to their Palestinian killings? That just seems downright unlikely to me. How does Wallen come to the conclusion that this fear might be the same amount of harm as 30,000 deaths and not 1,000 deaths or 200,000 deaths? Maybe Israel is being overly mild in its reaction. Who knows? None of this is a particular problem for Wallen, though, because when your entire moral calculus is based on some abstract and hard to pin down thing like the fear an entire nation experiences, you can kind of come to whatever conclusion you want. I mean, the claim that Israeli fear is equally harmful to 30,000 killings seems preposterous to me, but how exactly can I argue that position? It's completely vibes-based. At any rate, the thing about Wallen's argument is that it ripens. When you first hear it, you think, well, that doesn't sound quite right, but then it just kind of gets worse and worse as you come to bigger and bigger problems with it. Let's go to the next paragraph, where Wallen continues to elaborate on the possible proportionality of Israel's response.
There are roughly 7 million Jews living in Israel now, most of whom seem to feel, based on my own informal discussions with Israelis, that living with Hamas operating on its border is intolerable.
Now, let's just say that Wallen is correct here. The majority of Israelis would describe the present situation as intolerable. It's not like Wallen has real proof for this claim, but we'll allow him the assumption. In that case, I think we have to figure out what we mean by intolerable. What is the nature of this intolerability, and what should it mean to us? That may seem like an odd question, but let me take a step back for a second. Wallen says that Israelis find living near Hamas intolerably frightening and traumatic, and that this psychic harm is why the IDF's actions in Gaza may be proportional. But given the fact that Wallen correctly thinks most of these 30,000 Palestinians will be non-combatants, people completely unrelated to the terror attacks, it only makes sense to ask a question. What if the shoe was on the other foot? What if the only way Israel could destroy Hamas was to sacrifice 30,000 innocent Israeli lives? Well, in that case, I suspect that living next to Hamas would suddenly become quite tolerable to Israelis, that at the very least they would find it a lot more tolerable than killing 30,000 of their own people. I don't have objective proof for that claim, of course, but it seems quite obvious to me, and I'd be genuinely surprised if anyone disagreed with it. I mean, Hamas killing 1,200 Israelis was the traumatic event that started all this, so it's hard to imagine that people would see the killing of an additional 29,000 as an equal harm. But that's weird, right? Like, what's the difference here? In either case, Hamas's actions would be the same amount of terrifying, right? And in either case, 30,000 innocent people would be lost. Yet now, these events don't seem proportional to each other. At least they probably wouldn't seem proportional to most Israelis. So what's going on here? Well, it's obvious, right? Wallen acts like the enacting of psychic harm and the taking of human life can be compared so easily to each other. 7 million scared Israelis, 30,000 dead Palestinians, I guess that makes sense. But no, that doesn't work because these proportions are biased, based on an inconsistent moral calculus. To put it bluntly, the only reason the actions of Israel could appear proportional, the only way that Israeli fear and trauma could be worth so many lives, is if you don't care that much about Palestinian death. Okay, at this point the paper just goes right off a cliff. Because now, Wallen has to attend to the most obvious objection to his case. If we are so worried about psychic harm, well, why are we only talking about the psychic harm of Israelis? Haven't Gazans been experiencing some pretty intense trauma lately? This is what Wallen first says about the topic, and I'm just gonna make Dan read the whole thing to you. I'm so sorry, Dan.
To take that idea seriously, the idea being that Israel is justified in its full-scale war against Hamas, we have to suppose that they think that avoiding that insecurity is important enough to justify causing the collateral damage that will come from deposing Hamas. If we assume that will be around 30,000 deaths, then the implicit ratio the Israelis are invoking is something like 1 collateral death for every 200 Israelis who would otherwise live in a state of profound insecurity. That number needs to be adjusted, however, for those Gazans who will necessarily, no matter how the war ends, carry a similar, if not greater, psychic burden because of the war. Those who lost loved ones in the war presumably fit this description. Let us assume 10 Palestinians will carry that burden for every Palestinian who is killed. Let us add to that the number who are injured and who will carry that burden for the rest of their lives. Suppose that number is 5 times higher than the number killed. If we add those numbers together, we get about 500,000. If we offset the number of Israelis with a claim to avoid a psychic burden by that number, the number of Israelis whose psychic burden counts will still be close to 6 million. The ratio would still be something like 1 collateral death for every 200 or so Israelis who would otherwise live in a state of profound insecurity. I find that I cannot reject that as an unreasonable balance. In other words, once we count psychic harm, it looks like Israel's war might be proportional.
So I guess I have to say the obvious here. The method that Wallen is using to make his moral calculation is downright insane. Just unhinged ethics professor nonsense. Let me try to take you through it as best I can. Imagine the 10 people who are closest to you in the world. Maybe you have a husband or a few kids, maybe you have some best friends, some siblings, some parents. Think about the people who mean the world to you, who populate your days, who are there for you. Now, let me pose you a question. Which do you think sounds worse? Having me shoot one of those people blat blat right in the head, or living in your home in Israel for years while Hamas just continues to exist? Wallen quite literally places these two experiences as equal. In fact, he hinges his entire moral calculation on that assessment. And that truly makes no sense to me. For one thing, one of the main reasons to be afraid of Hamas terrorism is the negligible chance that one of their attacks could kill your loved ones. So how could you call that fear roughly as traumatic as one of your loved ones literally dying? But perhaps more importantly, it just goes against basic intuitions that I imagine almost everyone has. Like, speaking personally, I would just go to Israel. Like, if I had to move to Tel Aviv for work or something, and I otherwise wanted to move there, I would simply go and probably not even think about getting blowed up. On the other hand, if you killed my mom or whatever, I'd be pretty upset about that. That would actually really get to me. That's a microaggression in my culture. It's impossible for me to give a good estimate here, but I would think it would be about 10,000 times worse than living in Israel for a long time while Hamas still exists. And his strange calculations concerning the pain of losing loved ones isn't the whole problem. He also thinks getting literally injured is equally psychically harmful to worrying about Hamas while living in Israel, a claim that I find preposterous on its face. And then there's all the other stuff that he doesn't even mention. What about the lasting psychic harm of being evacuated from your home, as more than 1 million people have been? How about having your home or office bombed? Nearly 40,000 buildings have been destroyed, and even if those buildings are repaired after years, these things will leave lasting trauma on people. And I could, of course, go on here. The situation Gazans find themselves in right now is horrific, and the wounds of these events, both material and psychic, will no doubt last a lifetime. I guess the only thing to say is this. Wallen, your math does not add up. You did a really, really bad job with it. This is a moral calculation that takes Israeli feelings to be orders of magnitude more important and worthy of consideration than Palestinian lives and Palestinian feelings. Yes, I'm wearing a different sweater now. No, that's not going to stop me. We're keeping on going. Okay, at this point in the paper, Wallen pulls back and responds to a possible objection to his argument. Well, he responds to two, actually, but I'm only interested in the second one. He writes,
"An objection is that there is no need to get to the issue of proportionality because the necessity condition is not met. It is not met because there are less harmful ways to reduce the terror from Hamas. It can be either degraded or contained. The response to this objection is that it seems false. Israel has degraded Hamas, killing or imprisoning its fighters or leaders before, and it has come back stronger. And it has tried containing it too. It has had a blockade in place since 2007 aimed at preventing Hamas from arming itself. The attack of October 7th showed that the blockade failed. And even if better border security might have contained that attack, making this war unnecessary, Hamas can learn from past mistakes and find new ways to attack. It is not unreasonable to think that Hamas must be deposed for Israel to prevent it from attacking again."
Okay, just to rephrase, what Wallen's saying there is, look, you might think Israel's occupation is unnecessary because there are other ways of getting rid of Hamas's threat, but no, that doesn't seem true. We've already tried jailing them and blockading them, and at this point, it seems the only way to exterminate the threat of Hamas is to launch this big war. So, as far as I'm concerned, Wallen is making two pretty big, unjustified justified assumptions in this argument, and neither of these assumptions are too hard to spot, in my opinion. First, Wallen is here arguing that some military action is necessary to depose Hamas, but in the rest of the paper, Wallen goes much further than this, claiming that killing 30,000 mostly non-combatants will probably be necessary.
It will have to kill thousands more.
And Wallen's paper is about defending that second claim, arguing that killing those 30,000 is proportional. You see the problem, right? Even if we agree that some military action is necessary to neutralize the threat of Hamas, that would not inherently mean that 30,000 mostly civilians need to die to achieve that goal. Wallen simply does not argue for the likely necessity of killing that many people, and I find that deeply strange. Later on in this article, Wallen claims that the current Israeli government is, quote,
stocked with genocidal extremists.
But if that's the case, why would you essentially give that government the benefit of the doubt as it kills thousands of the people it's genocidal against? No, these guys committing genocide need to kill 30,000 people if they want to take out Hamas. I believe that number. Why? Like, I'm not a military strategist, but neither are you, Wallen, so I don't know why you're making this massive assumption. Second, and I think this one is much more important, why is Wallen so sure that a big occupation that kills all these people will be effective at destroying the threat of Palestinian terrorism? Before October 7th, around half of Gazans lived below the poverty line, they were massively unemployed, and they faced incredibly stifling economic sanctions. Now, the conditions are far worse. Thousands and thousands have been killed, traumatized, left grieving for loved ones, homes and neighborhoods have been destroyed, a massive number of lives have been ruined. Now, maybe Wallen is right. Maybe all we have to do to make sure October 7th doesn't happen again is to kill the political organization that did it. But maybe he's wrong. Maybe he is unbelievably wrong. Maybe the violence Israel is carrying out against Gaza will only make them more radical and more likely to commit violence against Israelis. After all, who is more likely to endanger himself in the quest to murder an Israeli? Someone with a home and a family and security, or someone whose life has been destroyed and who lives in hell? Wallen writes later in the paper,
Hamas is now more popular than ever among the Palestinians because it fights for their dignity.
And he cites an article making the case for that point. But if he believes that, why would he assume that more Israeli killing and bombing will solve the problem? In his argument, Wallen goes over a list of things Israel has tried in its effort to neutralize Hamas.
Israel has degraded Hamas, killing or imprisoning its fighters or leaders before, and it has come back stronger. And it has tried containing it too. It has had a blockade in place since 2007 aimed at preventing Hamas from arming itself.
And of course, he's right, so maybe we have to try something else now. Okay, in the last paragraphs of his paper, Wallen wants to make one thing clear. He doesn't know that Israel's actions are proportional. In fact, he claims the only way that Israel's actions can be proportional is if they treat Gaza well after Hamas has been destroyed. He writes,
how could the misery the war is inflicting on Gazans not fully offset the psychic gains for the Israelis? The answer is that it could count for less if, for most Gazans, it is much more short-lived psychic pain than that which the Israelis would otherwise suffer. But the only way for it to be much more short-lived is if Israel takes it upon itself as soon as possible to reassure the Gazans that Gaza will not only be rebuilt better than before, but it will be set free as part of a two-state solution. The alternative, in which Israel simply goes back to occupying Gaza, imposing daily humiliations on the Palestinians, would leave the Gazans with at least as much psychic burden as that which the Israelis seem to want to cite to justify their war.
Looking at these final thoughts, I think they seem pretty positive and agreeable. Wallen is not uncritical of Israel, he doesn't wholly support its government or its treatment of Palestine, and it is entirely plausible from Wallen's account that Israel's actions will be immoral and unjust. As Wallen ends the paper,
Israeli citizens should seize this opportunity to change course and make good faith efforts to establish a two-state solution, and outside powers that have some influence in the region should do what they can to pressure Israel to pursue that path towards peace. If it does, it may find Palestinian partners, but if it does not, then it deserves condemnation for waging a disproportionate war.
To be clear, I think that's good. I think it's meaningful that Wallin ends on this idea. But in the end, I think this conclusion is less thoughtful than it might seem, and that's for two reasons. First, I just don't think it's true. I just don't agree, obviously. The harm Israel is doing to Gaza right now is extreme and will last an extremely long time. If Israel does wish to rebuild Palestine, this will take years and years, and people will suffer tremendously in the meantime. The trauma of this experience will not go away when the conflict ends. Even in the realistic best-case scenario, I don't think Israel's actions are proportional. Second, I just don't buy this whole thing. I don't know. See, while I don't think lasting peace in this region is impossible, I do think it's very strange to hinge your political assessment on it. The fact is, given its history and given the attitudes of its people, I think Israel is quite unlikely to rally around a two-state solution or to build a better Gaza in the aftermath of this occupation. Say I accidentally lost my friend's keychain, so he burned my house down, but afterward he bought me a new big Mr. Beast house to enjoy. Were his actions now proportional? I mean, maybe, since he repaired so much of the harm he did, but that's not a very insightful political commentary, in my opinion. Look, I don't know what Wallin believes in his heart of hearts. I don't know what his true policy desires are vis-a-vis Israel, but that doesn't really change the project of this paper. Wallin wants to argue that Israel's actions in the here and now are proportional and necessary, that the fear and trauma caused by Hamas is equal to the harm caused by the current occupation. He argues this position poorly, and that makes sense. The claim that making a lot of people afraid can be a just cause for killing 30,000 Gazans seems preposterous on its face, and the rest of the paper only makes the problem worse. Wallin uses a sloppy, unintuitive, and frankly biased moral calculus. And if Wallin's argument now hinges on Israel being a perfect, beneficent angel in the aftermath of this conflict, that doesn't make his case more reasonable. It just means that he sees, on some level, that it is unreasonable. This video is much longer than I thought it would be. It took a much longer time than I thought it would, and so we'll end here on a quick note. I've spent this entire video just accepting Wallin's numbers. 30,000 Palestinians, mostly non-combatants, will be killed. In truth, I think this is a vast and obvious understatement. Evacuating more than 1 million people, bombing thousands and thousands of buildings, personally, I believe these actions will come with a far greater human cost. Because of this, I feel the need to ask, Dr. Wallin, how many deaths will it take for you to condemn Israel?